Hi, everyone. Just a quick review of what we covered last week in class to help you prepare for the final. So, first topic is imperative verbs. Looking again at our hopefully familiar chart now, we're on the imperative line. And so we've already talked about verb consecutive, imperfect, and perfect, and jussive in past classes. So this week we're going to talk about imperative and the infinitives. So what is an imperative? An imperative is a command. So in any language, the command form of the verb is referred to as the imperative. So in Biblical Hebrew, we might have things like go, send, or smite, even a possibility. So all come to us in the command form. So it's important to recognize that imperatives only appear in the second person. So you can make commands either to you, so you as an individual do something, or in the plural, you all do something. So those are the only two forms of imperatives that show up in Biblical Hebrew or in most languages. And of course, our big question is, how do I identify imperatives? Because that's essentially what we're doing in our parsing exercise for the final. So imperatives in the call, which of course are far and away the most common, have a schwa under the first root letter. So if you think about our memorization verse that we did, or our reading verse for our oral exam way back last quarter, that verse started Shema Yisrael. So the sound, the schwa sound under the first letter is very short and very distinctive. So you don't really see something like this in many other places in the language, although it's possible to confuse them with another form that we'll be talking about coming right up. But it sort of makes sense that the imperative would begin with a very short sound. So if you've studied Greek at all, you'll maybe you've never thought about this, but if you look at the Greek forms of the imperative, they're all very short. They're very short sounds, and it fits with, I would say, the cultural setting of an imperative. You would want a word that is indeed very short and very succinct if you're making a command. Makes sense. So the plural imperative, so y'all here, actually has a heroic vowel under the first root letter. So just looking at this, you might, I guess, potentially confuse this with a PL, because PL often will begin with a heroic vowel under the first root letter. But one thing that this form doesn't have that a PL form would have would be some sort of a vowel other than a schwa under the second root letter, and assuming the second root letter can take a dagesh, we would expect to see that, and here we don't have that either. So that's one way to distinguish between imperatives in the plural and PL verbs. That would, I would say, be the only thing you could probably confuse that with. So singular typically have schwas under the first root letter, and plurals have schwa under the second root letter, and heroic vowels under the first root letter. So imperatives have no prefixes, only suffixes. So you would not, I don't think, confuse this with an imperfect verb or a verb consecutive or a jussive. So your only potential confusion is with perfect verbs. So just something to keep in mind. Try to keep the perfect verbs separate and distinctive from the imperatives. But probably far more importantly is the context in which these verbs appear in. So while it seems like they might be easily confused or mistaken for other forms, it's actually not as difficult as it seems, just because the verses will often set you up for an imperative. So if we look at this example from Exodus 9:22, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Nate et yadecha al hashemayim. So we would translate this as, and Yahweh said to Moses, Nate, so that's our imperative in this verse. So stretch out, and then et, what are we stretching out? At your hand. All Hashemayim, the all here is a little bit strange because usually we think of all being over, but it's sort of over the heavens or over the sky. So stretch out your hand over the sky, and you'll have to imagine how that looks in real life. This is from the plague narratives. I don't remember which plague specifically. But so we have, in essence, a Vayomer, Yahweh speaking to somebody, and then the very first word is a verbal form, and we're not really surprised to see that as a command. It just sort of comes very natural from the setting of the narrative here. So even though I've given you what I would call the official form of the imperative, probably by number, most imperatives have this special short form, and I don't really know kind of why that is, they're so common I wouldn't call them irregular, and maybe it's just that the most commonly used verbs are also verbs that are weak. But number-wise, I bet if you counted them up and looked at how many imperative verbs follow kind of this form with the schwa under the first root letter, or the hirik if it's a plural, versus kind of these short forms, I bet if you counted them all up, the short form imperatives would win. And I think they also kind of make sense if you start thinking about why this happens. So we have the root hey lamed kaf halach, and the imperative is just lech, so just a really short word that drops the hey. So we're used to seeing by now hey drop out and the imperfect with this root, and with the jussive and with the vav consecutive in this root. So that's not so unusual, but yet this doesn't conform really at all with the imperatives that we saw on the previous page. So there's a bunch of these. The imperative for nun taf nun, to give, so the imperative give is just ten or tain. The first nun drops out, and we get this really short word, tain. Our root to take, lamed kof chet. The lamed, remember, in this sort of oddball root drops out in certain cases, so we have just kach, take. For yada, we just have da, know, like know that I am God, something along those lines. And for beit vav aleph, we have bo, just go in. And again, I think these are kind of intuitive, but maybe a little unfortunate just in their form, because weak letters have dropped out and you end up with this very short little word that's maybe hard to differentiate. So going again to a setting that involves a divine command. So this is Genesis 22, the near sacrifice of Isaac. Vayomer, kachna, we'll talk just a second about na, et bincha, et yachidecha, asher ahavta, et yitzhak valech. So this first kach is followed by a particle na, and so that's really the topic of this slide. Na is kind of usually used in narratives like this as sort of soften the imperative, and so sometimes this is called the particle of entreaty. So it's kind of usually gives the speech a sense of more of a pleading rather than an order. It's often used in the Hebrew Bible where people are talking to superiors. So if you address the king, you might see this na particle. So you don't want to be seen ordering the king around. So maybe it's a good idea to, um, I don't know, add a na after your order to make the king seem like you're not too bossy. So this verse has two nice imperatives: kach at the beginning of the verse, and then if you go at the very end of the verse, we have lech. So lech is go and kach is take. And as you can imagine, give, take, go, come in are obviously very common forms. How do we do negative commands in Biblical Hebrew? You might think that a negative command would simply be some sort of word that means no or not, like lo. And then that would, I think, instinctually precede an imperative. So if an imperative is lech, then maybe a negative command don't go would be lo lech or something like that. But that's not the way Biblical Hebrew works. There are basically two forms used to negate commands. They are the words lo, which we're already familiar with from vocab, hopefully. And we also have the word all, which is just the two letters flipped, and which also just means no or not. So in the top form, as is from Exodus 20, verse 13, thou shalt not kill. So the negative command appears as lo plus the imperfect, lo tirtzach. But sometimes we get negative commands using the al plus jussive. And again, jussives and imperfects are often the same form, so sometimes we might not be able to differentiate the fact that all is preceding a jussive. But this is Genesis 15:1. Haya davar Adonai el Avram lemor al tir'ah. So translating this verse, v'haya, and it was, davar Adonai, the word of the Lord, el Avram, to Abraham, and then remember our word lemor, which just kind of works as quotation marks or tells us that direct speech is going to follow. So the next two words are al tir'ah, so don't be afraid. Usually the lo plus imperfect will give you commands that are more generally applied, or prohibitions, I should say, that are generally applied, where the all usually refers to more specific situations. So you can see lo tirtzach is a negative command that applies generally, whereas al tir'ah applies just to Abram's situation. So anyway, this is how commands are negated in Biblical Hebrew. Okay, let's move to our next topic, which is infinitives. Finally, Biblical Hebrew has two kinds of infinitives. One type is called the infinitive absolute, and one is called the infinitive construct. And of the two, the infinitive construct is more like what we refer to as the usual or normal infinitive in English. So in English, an infinitive is something like to run, to go, to walk, to sit, to stand, to kneel, to think, to do, something like that. So those are all infinitives in English. And the closest equivalent form in Biblical Hebrew is the infinitive construct. So think of infinitive construct as just the infinitive. So two types of infinitive: infinitives construct and infinitives absolute. So let's do the construct first. So here again, the official form, or the form that you would find in the back of the book in all those charts, is actually the equivalent to the imperative. They are exactly the same. Again, context, I think, will not allow you to confuse those two, but it's important to just realize that those two are exactly the same. However, considering most of the imperatives don't follow the quote unquote official format, if you see something in that form, the chances of it being an infinitive construct are probably better than it being an imperative. Um, and kind of one very little helpful marker in biblical Hebrew is that la usually accompanies and precedes the infinitive construct. So in this sense, la just meaning to. So again, to do, to walk, to stand, to sit, to go in, all of those things. Um, Typically, la will come before the infinitive construct. And if you just look at it, it'll look like an infinitive to you. Now, that's not to say that the infinitive construct is always preceded by la. So I would say maybe 60, 70% of the time it is, but it doesn't have to be. So again, just keep that in mind. So let's look at an example of the strong verb for dalet resh shin. The infinitive construct would be lidrosh. So this is how it looks when it's preceded by a lamed. Now we have the root beit vav aleph, so middle week looks like lavo. So notice that the vowel under the lamed here is a kametz and not a hirik like we see with the strong verb. This really maybe might not surprise you, I'm not sure. Remember we talked about that comments underneath the prefix and the imperfect and the vowel consecutive sort of being a sign of, um, I don't know, middle vav-ness coming up in the rest of the root. So here it shows up again. So I don't know if you can draw any hard and fast rules for that, but again, we have a prefix, sort of, a preformative, and we have a comments being a signal of the middle vav, if that's helpful. If it's not or too confusing, don't worry about it. So we have some more different vowels under the lamed. So we have our form lemor, which we just talked about. So lemor is actually the infinitive construct of the verbal root aleph mem resh, to say or to speak. So literally, lemor is to say, but grammatically, it's treated more like, again, like a quotation mark. Now they get a little odd. So we have ayin, sin, hey, to do, to make or do, and the infinitive construct is la'asot. So we still have the O vowel going on here, but the final hey has turned into a taf. And maybe that's not so weird because we know that, say for example, nouns that end in comets hey, when they go into construct, the hays become tofs. But still, that might be a tough form to parse if you didn't know what was going on there. A few more. Resh, aleph, hey, to see, very common root, obviously, is lir ot. So here again, the hey turns to a taf. Now it becomes even a little weirder. So we have yashav becomes lashevet. So notice that the first yod drops out and we get just a random taf at the end of this. So that one is even a little bit harder, I would say, to differentiate. We've seen that et ending at the end of call feminine singular participles. So in a sense, it works the same way here, but gosh, a little annoying. So halak, also first week, becomes la lechet. And yada becomes lada'at. Again, the yod drops out, hey drops out, so those first week letters are gone, and we get this tav at the end. And probably most annoyingly, but also very common, natan, nun, tav, nun, becomes latet. So we can see that the nun has dropped out, and we get an et ending like we did in the other forms where the first letter was weak, but here the et ending has also obliterated the second nun, so we have a form that basically just leaves its middle root letter, and we end up with latet. Yes, annoying, but very common to make it worse. So, how do we translate infinitives construct? If there's a lamed there, it's just like infinitives in English. So to sit, to stand, etc. If there's not a lamed, you should keep in the back of your mind that sometimes just adding ing will give you a pretty good English equivalent. So if there's no lamed, try adding ing and see how that verbal action goes. Now infinitive absolute, which isn't all that much like an infinitive. Infinitives absolute are pretty easy to identify because in the call they often follow this o vowel pattern. So think o infinitive absolute. So just an example, we have ahol, eating, we have haloch, walking, we have yatso, going out, we have shov, doesn't have the but it's middle weak. It does retain the O, so we have returning. And from Resh Aleph Hey, we get Ra-O, so the O vowel obliterates the final Hey there. But generally speaking, they kind of follow this A-O pattern. The primary use for the infinitive absolute is verbal intensification. Now, this is not the only use for the infinitive absolute, but I bet numerically it's probably 60-75% of the infinitives absolute are doing this type of thing. So this verse, Genesis 2, talking about the prohibition from eating the fruit in the middle of the garden. Vayetzav Adonai Elohim al ha'adam lemor michol eitz hagan achol tochel. So to translate the first part of the verse, Vayetzav, so and he commanded, that is the Lord God, all ha'adam, so on the man, which is kind of an interesting use of all once again. Lemor, which functions like our quotation marks. And then Mikol Eitz Hagan Achol Tochel. So when the infinitive absolute, which is the first of those two forms in the red, when it's functioning as an intensifier, it will be in this form and then followed by a verb either usually in the imperfect, but I think sometimes it could be in the perfect. I'd have to think about that. But those two verbs have to have the exact same root. So if you see two verbs that look like they're doing their verbal thing, one right after the other, this could be the phenomenon that you're encountering in your text. So, well, let's see. Going back to this translation, we have to figure out how to translate this form. So, achol tochel, we have to make it into some sort of an intensifier. So, I would go with something like from all the trees of the garden, from every tree of the garden, you may certainly eat, or you can surely eat, or um, I don't know, more colloquially, yes, you may eat from every tree in the garden. Of course, there's that one exception coming up, but some in your translation, some way has to reflect this idea of intensification. Um, so you may eat, you will eat, has to be you may eat, you will, or you really may eat, or you surely should eat, something like that. Um, Here's some ideas on this next slide. Surely, really, certainly, most certainly, any of those would work. Also, infinitives absolute, if they're not intensifying, if they're not fulfilling an intensification form, can also be translated by just adding ing. So um, I think just like participles, if you don't know what to do, try adding ing, and you'll hopefully get a little bit closer to a meaningful translation in English. Final topic, Niphal verbs. So here's the Niphal column. So Niphal, just like um, Hifil, PL, and call, have off consecutives, imperfects, perfects, imperatives. No infinitives absolute in the Niphal. And apparently there are some jussives in the Niphal. But now we're getting to verbs that aren't super rare, but much rarer than kind of your more mainstream PL, Hifil, and very mainstream call verbs. So not nearly as common, but they do show up. So the Niphal translation value often takes a verbal root and it makes it passive. So sometimes it's harder to think about, okay, what does it mean for a verbal action to be passive than it is to actually translate the form. So on the top form, we have a call, he heard. So how does that translate to passive? Nishman, the Niphal form. So Niphal have that nice nun at the beginning of them in the perfect. So that would be he or it was heard. So if you add the sort of helping verb here, was or were, depending on whether it's singular or plural, that will often get you a long way in getting the passive value, if you will, to the verb. Let's practice a few more. So, ra'ah, he saw. So, how does that sound in the passive? It becomes he or it was seen. Kara, he called. In the passive, in the Niphal, it becomes he or it was called. Sometimes people have said that the passive takes away the agency. So, um, say for example, he saw. We know who is doing the seeing, or we can guess who is doing the seeing. But if we say something was seen, we know an object was seen, but we don't really know who exactly is doing the seeing. So it's sort of devoid of its agency, or kind of talking around things sometimes a bit. A couple more examples. Lakach, he took, becomes what in the passive? It becomes he or it was taken. He found, so he found something, um, becomes he or it was found. But sometimes Niphal doesn't have this passive sense to it. I would say very, very, very often, maybe 70 or 80% it does. But there are some verbs that appear in the Niphal, only in the Niphal, and they're not passive. At least not to our English sensibilities do we see how they're passive. So they just work as regular active verbs. And the most common of these is nishba, um, which means he swore an oath or he swore to do something. So this particular root has no call. It always appears in the Niphal, I believe. And it's just a Niphal verb, but there's nothing overtly passive about it. So I guess my point being is that if you see a root and you know what the root means and you see it in a Niphal, you can probably guess uh, very accurately much of the time what that verb means in the Niphal. And if you're just reading a text and kind of reading along and not doing in-depth research, that's probably good enough for your reading. But if you don't really know for sure, or you're doing some sort of more intense research, just look up the root and look up the form and see what the definition is in the Niphal. Sometimes it could be slightly different. Sometimes uh, it doesn't need to be passive at all. So the Niphal imperfect um, is a little bit um, different in a sense. So we have the same prefixes and sometimes suffixes. But what to me is really distinctive about the Niphal imperfect is this vowel pattern. So ye ka re, he or it was called, he or it may be called or could be called, something like that for a definition. But that e, e vowel pattern is not something that you see anywhere else in the language that I know of. Also, what's typical for Niphal, if you look at your strong verb chart, is that the first root letter has a dagesh. And that probably is due to the fact that there used to be a nun there somewhere in the language because it is Niphal, and all the perfect forms of the Niphal are preceded by nun. But the imperfects, uh, because they are the prefixed forms, so in the battle of prefixes versus nuns, nuns clearly are going to lose. So the nuns in these have dropped out and they've become the dagesh in the first root letter. But this e, a, e is a very distinctive vowel pattern. What does it look like in vav consecutive? So in the top form, we have vayimatse, and he or it will be found. So we have the e, a, e vowel pattern again. We also have the dagesh in the first root letter, as we might expect. The next one is fairly common, but maybe a little tougher to differentiate. Vaye Ra is, and he or it will be seen. So this comes from the root Resh Aleph Hey, and of course Hay's always drop out in the Bob consecutive, so we don't expect to see that. If you found this in a text that you were working on, and we're not quite sure whether, is this call, is this Niphal, we would expect to see a dagesh in the first root letter, but Resh doesn't take dagesh, so we have a little bit of a problem. Um, if I were in your shoes, I would probably go to the dictionary and look under the root Resh Aleph Hey, and there will be examples there, I am positive, of what the Niphal Vav consecutive looks like for this particular root. So there will be examples for you to look at, and you can see if the vowel pattern in the text you're working on matches the vowel pattern that the dictionary has. But in general, these Niphal Vav consecutives don't appear that often. 446 times in the Bible. That's not very many times. So the chances of you having one in your final final translation project is probably low, but it could happen. You may encounter one. Niphal imperatives, even fewer occurrences of those in the Bible, but they're pretty weird. So they have a hit prefix. So you might potentially confuse this with a hifil. It's possible. Um, Notice though that there's no characteristic yod infix between the mem and the resh, between the roots letters 2 and 3, like you would see it on Niphal. Also, there is that telltale dagesh in the first root letter. But the Niphal imperative is Hishma, Hishamer. Sorry, Hishamer. That is it. Hope you have a great time studying. Let me know if you have any questions about any of these items.